afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're here to give you a presentation on the employment of guide dog handlers based on some research that I was a research associate and did for Cnib.
Introduce yourself.
My name is Danika Blackstock.
Okay, and my name is Mahadeo Sukhai. This is the third time I'm up here. That's 3 times too many, I think. So I'm Cnib's Head of Research, Chief Accessibility Officer. If you weren't in session 502 this morning or 302 yesterday, that's terrible. You don't know what you were missing, but welcome. This is also the last session of the day, and this is going to be your last session of the Connecting the Dots 2019 conference, so woohoo. Welcome to those who are also on live stream. House rules, if you have a question, please do your best to shout it as best as you can. Danika or I will repeat the question so that the folks on live stream can engage with it, or will answer the question in such a way so that the question itself was obvious. We don't do hands. Feel free to yell at the top of your lungs when you have a question during the question period. There's very few people who are sitting within my field of view in the first 3 tables, so I'm assuming the room is empty. That joke worked this morning. It got a laugh. I can tell because nobody's laughing. There's nobody in the room. Okay. Okay, everyone's apparently in the back of the room. We're all like the cool kids this afternoon, right? the ones who sit in the back and who don't pay attention and who twiddle their thumbs and check their phones. Sorry?
I'm in the middle.
You're in the middle. Excellent. Well, that's.
I still check my phone sometimes.
Okay, fair enough. So this is who we are. Danika's going to run most of this presentation. You'll hear from me a couple of times, but over to Danika.
Awesome. So first, to begin, the reason why we did this research study is because there's a lack of research about guide dog handlers' experiences within Canada. So I began the project with a literature review, so looking at all of the sources that were out there that were related to guide dog handlers and their experiences. And there were very few pieces of literature to go off of, and the pieces of literature that did exist didn't have a Canadian context or focus. So this is one of the first that we've seen that has kind of taken more of a Canadian perspective on things. There's also inconsistent legislation within Canada regarding the access rights and the different rules around guide dogs and service dogs. So this was another aim of the research study more broadly, but this isn't something that we're going to particularly cover today. So our study took the form kind of in 2 phases. So the first part of the study was a focus group. So I held focus groups of guide dog handlers from across the country. And this had about 35 participants. And all of the questions I asked were more open-ended, just to kind of get an idea of general experiences and understanding how we should structure the next part of the research, which was more of a quantitative approach, kind of looking at a survey, which was done in an online format. So the survey, like I said, was an online format, and it was broken into several different sections. So the sections that we looked at aligned with Cnib's Bold Dreams, Bright Futures strategic plan. So there were, along with demographic information, 3 kind of areas that we focused on, which were boosting participation in the world of work, which had to do with employment, unleashing the power of technology, or as we called it, technology use, and driving achievement and equality, or we kind of looked at it as more of kind of access and people's experiences with access with taking a guide dog into public spaces and kind of their overall interpretation of how they were treated and when they had issues. this allowed, like I said, for a mixed methods approach. So we were able to get kind of the anecdotes from the first half of the research and the focus groups, but then we were also able to have kind of more hard statistics to be able to use going forward. And this presentation also has some aspects from the International Levels of Employment Survey, or ILS as we call it, just to kind of allow us to have some comparison. So just to kind of go over some of the statistics, we found that 56% of our respondents lived in Ontario, which doesn't really disperse the population too well. 46% of those lived in a city, which was defined as 100,000 to 1 million people. 55% of respondents have been a guide dog user for 10 or more years, which was just over half, and participants were between 15 to 74 years old, so we had quite the wide range of participant age demographics to look at. So we also looked at, like I said, types of employment. So 57% of participants indicated that they were currently employed, and 94% of all participants indicated that they had been employed in some point in their lifetime, which is quite a large number. 44% indicated that they were employed in a full-time permanent position, which was the highest area of employment, and the next highest category in that question was people who were retired. So we had either people who were mostly fully employed as part of our study and permanent, or people who were retired, which probably has to do also with the age distribution. And 66% of employed respondents worked in a non-disability specific sector. So for me, I found that quite interesting that they were kind of all over the place in their field of work as well.
So a couple of interesting things about the demographics that Danika has presented so far from a general kind of comparison perspective. You're going to say, well, 56% of the responses came from Ontario. How representative is that? Well, in Canada, Ontario as a province holds 40 to 45% of the Canadian population. So it's a pretty hefty province regardless. And when a lot of people do these kinds of surveys, what they tend to do is they tend to do Ontario against everybody else, or they'll tend to do Ontario and Quebec against everybody else, just because of the nature of the demographic. The city distribution that Danika also mentioned is consistent with what we were talking about yesterday in session 302, where I said that from the International Levels of Employment study, 64% of our client population lives in cities of 100,000 people or more. The Canadian population, it's only 51, and so Danika sort of pulled out the 100,000 to 1 million and identified 46%. So those are a couple of comparisons just to demonstrate the numbers that we're getting are actually reasonable and sort of proportional to what we would expect from the Canadian-wide sort of sample that we had to draw from. The employment comparisons where things get really interesting. Because within the International Levels of Employment study, we can do something. We can actually ask the question, okay, for all the guide dog users in the ILES, what was your employment rate? For all the white cane users in the ILES, what was your employment rate? For the giant proportion of individuals who are blind or partially sighted who use neither cane nor dog, what was your employment rate? So this actually became a bit of an interesting comparison when we did it, and so again, 42% of the ILES population, 42% of our working age clients, 18 to 64, had a job. I'm not counting what kind of job. I'm just saying they have a job. Now, 2/3 of this population happens to have a full-time job, which is a bit distinctive from what we were finding with the guide dog participant data from the Guide Dog Advocacy Survey, also from the guide dog participant data with the ILES. And so the guide dog employment rate was about the same in both instruments. It was actually quite, well, not the guide dog employment rate. Guide dogs are employed at 100%. 50% rate. But the guide dog user or the guide dog handler employment rate is actually pretty high. It's in the high 50s, which is substantially higher than the employment rate of the general working age blind or partially sighted population. So there's a nuance there that we want to unpack in this presentation. We'll come back to in our discussion. And like I said, about 2/3 have a full-time job, but Danika's data suggested that actually the proportion of guide dog handlers who had a full-time job was higher, and I think it was closer to like 3/4 or 78%. And so again, there's a bit of a discrepancy, well, a bit of a difference in terms of the kinds of jobs that somebody who's a guide dog handler is going to go into. Greater likelihood of employment, greater likelihood of full-time employment. 66% in non-disability related sectors meant there's 34% in disability related sectors. And so in looking at the disability not-for-profit space in the ILES, that's only about 10% of the population. So is there a potential skew in terms of where guide dog handlers are going? It's possible. But I mean, the sample sizes of guide dog handlers in Canada who are willing to actually fill out a survey like this are relatively small, so I wouldn't necessarily read too much into that. And so the other thing, of course, with the ILES data is that many factors actually contribute to that level of employment. We unpacked some of them yesterday in session 302. We talked about some other things this morning. And so the interesting question that's worth having this discussion about is how do those factors actually relate in the context of guide dogs and guide dog handlers and the lived experience of guide dog teams in Canada. You don't actually get to disclose in a job interview when you go into that job interview and your dog is with you, right? You don't get to disclose because the dog does it for you. The dog's right there, right? And so the same thing happens when you walk in as a cane user. You don't get to disclose. And so then you can't control that disclosure. So that is a qualitative issue, a bit of a difference. We know that community size impacts the quality of your employment. We know that your education is going to impact the quality of your employment. We know the age of onset of sight loss. We know that the age at the severity of your sight loss, those are also going to impact your employment. All of those things are potentially true to different ways and in different degrees in the guide dog population as well. Danika?
Thank you. So we also looked at employer accommodations. So the questions we asked were more to understand the climate of the organization and the types of support people felt that they were getting towards not only their own needs, but also the needs that they have with having a guide dog. So things like allowing, we didn't ask this specifically, but for what I'm thinking about when it relates to accommodations with a guide dog is allowing for time to take the dog outside or allowing for a spot for the dog to be part of, not the team, but kind of just like laying beside you and having that welcoming environment. So we found that 45% of participants change jobs or companies after receiving their guide dog. So it meant that they would have started a new position or company with, as Mahadeo said, bringing that guide dog in as a disclosure right off the bat. 70% of participants had pre-existing work experience before receiving their guide dog. 57% of participants brought their guide dog to job interviews, so the disclosing of their disability right off the bat is also relevant there as well. And so many of those people, more than half of our sample, were bringing their dogs to those interviews. 77% of respondents said that their employers were at least somewhat accommodating towards their guide dog, and 22% said that it wasn't applicable to them. So that adds up to about 99% of the people who filled out the survey. 1% of the people who had a job felt that their employer was not accommodating towards them. So these findings are interesting due to some of the stigma that surrounds someone having a visible disability and walking in right off the bat as somebody who has a visual impairment or sight loss, and the employer knowing from the very beginning, but still saying that they have these accommodating employers, and especially because so much of that population is in the non-disability sector too. So there has to be some form of accommodation within that as well.
So there's an interesting point here around some of the qualitative differences that we find within the sight loss community. Not everyone has a dog. In fact, I've actually run this as a societal participation test, and in chatting with sighted colleagues on a variety of topics, I will often sort of drop into conversation. So how many people who are blind or partially sighted do you think have guide dogs? And I hear some interesting numbers. I hear 50%. I hear 10%. And I keep telling them, no, you have to go lower. I hear 1%, and I keep telling them, no, you have to go lower. And when they finally hit the right range, which is sort of the 0.2 to 0.4% range, and I say, yeah, you got it, their response is, oh my gosh, really? But we see guide dogs everywhere. And my response is, that's good, but that's not representative of the overall population. So that I'm hoping you're starting to see some of the nuances of the population. You've got guide dog users, you've got cane users, you've got individuals who do neither. I'm bobbing up here without a cane, and although dogs love me, I don't have a guide dog. Guide dogs think they own me, but that's different. There are individuals who, for personal choice, will use a cane or a dog or neither. There are individuals who, because of personal choice, will take a dog to a job interview and have that dog disclosed on their behalf, or not. And individuals who will take their cane to a job interview and have the cane disclosed for them, or not. And so there's some qualitative differences in here. When Danika mentioned the term visible disability, and when you hear that term visible disability, you often think sight loss, hearing loss, physical or mobility disability. And we are conditioned to think that those are visible disabilities. Society is conditioned to think those are visible disabilities. And academics are conditioned to think those are visible disabilities. Academics are separate from society. We like to believe that of ourselves. But the truth is that what makes a disability visible isn't what type of disability one has, which is a categorical term, and I don't like it. It's actually how we mediate our function within the world. And so I'm going to offer you a definition of visible disability that perhaps we haven't really thought about, and it goes like this. If you are using an assistive aid, and whether that aid is canine or human or technological, if that aid is visible to people around you, then you have a visible disability. And so it isn't the disability itself that is visible, it is how you're interacting with the world in the context of that lived experience that makes the disability visible. And so every guide dog user, every guide dog handler, Danika with Ulysses, for example, the dog mediates the visibility of Danika's sight loss, right? Or the cane mediates the visibility. But we've talked about how those things can be situation dependent. Somebody who uses hearing aids, if the hearing aids are tiny, then they're not visible. And so only if you've got this ginormous hearing aid on your ear will someone actually know that you're using a hearing aid. If you've got a sign language interpreter in the room with you, or you're using CART or real-time captioning, then someone will know that you have a hearing loss. If you have a wheelchair or a scooter or a walker or a crutch, then somebody will know you have a mobility impairment. But otherwise, people won't know because people are not conditioned to pick up on those things. So I want you to think about that, because as we talk about guide dog use, we're really talking about a particular portion of the sight loss population who have an inadvertently visible disability versus a portion of a sight loss population that doesn't. And so let's talk about some education findings now. And again, with respect to the international levels of employment study data, we're able to unpack education outcomes for individuals who are guide dog users and versus individuals who are white cane users. And so the interesting thing, remember some of the education outcomes data I talked with you about yesterday, we had in the ILES, we had about 5% of the overall population who didn't finish high school, about 25% who finished high school but didn't go beyond. So there's 30% of the population that went as far as high school and stopped, and 70% of the population that went beyond high school and actually got a college or a college certificate or diploma or a university degree or multiple university degrees. So for white cane users, the interesting thing was that white cane users were 5 times as likely to actually have less than a high school education as their highest degree of education compared to guide dog handlers. So most white cane users, so white cane users, 5% of that population would stop at high school or not even get through high school. Only 1% of guide dog handlers didn't get through high school. Right? And then, you know, when we look at the other side of it, when we look at the graduate degree, a guide dog handler was much more likely to have a master's, a PhD, or a professional degree, twice as much. So that's 27.7% of guide dog handlers versus only about 14.5% of individuals who used white cane. So there's an interesting disparity there. Guide dog handlers are more employed. Guide dog handlers are better educated. Is there a cause and effect relationship? We don't know. White cane users are less employed. The number's 36%. I'm going to just drop that very quietly into the live stream and into a room of, I don't know, only 2 people, and just let it float out there into the world, right? Because now I've said it, I can't take it back. But it's a small room, and I'm not going to be lynched by a small room. And so the employment rate of white cane users is 36%. The average employment, the overall employment rate of the general blind or partially sighted population is 42%, and half of that population uses a white cane. So recognizing that, now you've got the other half of the population who doesn't use a white cane. Their average employment rate is 48%, and that includes the dog users. And so you've got this disparity. So white cane users are less well-educated on average, and they're less employed on average. Guide dog users are more educated on average and more employed on average. And there's an interesting question there about what's cause and effect versus what's just an association. Danika?
So as part of this survey, we also looked at the technology aspects of things. So we found that 96% of guide dog handlers said that they use a smartphone or tablet, which was quite interesting considering that a great majority of our participants were considered to be in the older adult range of, I guess, what is defined as older adulthood. 83% of the smartphone and tablet users said that they used apps while working their guide dog. So these things were things such as navigation apps, reader apps, magnification apps, and training apps. So they're utilizing the smartphone to facilitate, I guess, better and more comprehensive travel with their guide dog.
Before Danika goes on, I'm going to interrupt with one other comparison. We did another study last year into this year where we actually looked at technology use patterns across the Cnib client population as a whole. And so that population had an age range of 15 to 80 something. So it was comparable to Danika's, as opposed to the ILES, which was working age only. The smartphone utilization rate across the entirety of that population was nowhere near 96%. Anybody want to take a guess as to what it was? Going once, going twice. Sold. It was about a third of that number. So the smartphone utilization rate across the entirety of the Cnib client cohort, again aged 15 to about 80 something, was only around 30 to 33% in that range, plus or minus a couple of percentage. 96% of guide dog handlers in Danika's study are using smartphones. Now there's a potential bias there that the folks who filled out the survey are all online. And so they're all technology users generally, but that's less meaningful, I would think, because being a technology user doesn't mean you're a smartphone user. A lot of older adults that include the population that Danika's survey contains will have a desktop but not a smartphone or a tablet. And
Can I have a question?
you may, go ahead.
So the 33% people
Yeah.
who don't use a smartphone, did they fill out the surveys online as well?
Online and phone. We can separate out, well, yeah, we might be able to separate out phone from online, but I actually think that the two numbers are not that far apart with that population, just because of who sort of completed that study, right? There's an age dependency in technology use that we found, and even within the youngest cohort of people, so if we looked only at the 15 to 24-year-olds, the smartphone use was only 60% in that population of CNIB clients. And again, Danika's got almost complete penetration of smartphones. So there is an increased technology use for dog handlers compared to the general population. Danika?
Thank you. And to speak a little bit more about technology, we also asked to go along with the access and the education that guide dog handlers felt that the public needed. 56% of the respondents said that having access to information about training and guide dog rights in a video format would be useful. So being able to share that through technology as well to get the message across to people in society as a whole, as well as in their own life. Respondents they agreed that the use of the technology would just allow the message to get across a lot faster and help with people understanding like the certain etiquettes that go along with a working guide dog as well. So we have a few discussion questions that we were hoping that people would like to share their opinions on. So the first question we have is, why do you think guide dog handlers have a higher employment rate overall? And to go along with that, why is full-time employment higher? And just feel free to shout out your answers.
Can I take a crack at it?
Sure.
Go for it.
I'm Amanda. I've been trying to challenge myself to go outside with the obvious answer, and I honestly I can't find one, so I'm hoping someone can challenge this opinion. But I feel like people who aren't from the blind community aren't as afraid of dogs. Like canes are very just rigid and they don't understand them, whereas people can instantly look at a dog and be like, oh, like a furry little friend. They're more open and they're more willing to listen because they're like, wow, we can have a dog in the office, yay. But I feel like canes kind of scare people. There's all these things they don't know, and I feel like dogs are more familiar to an employer, just from a stigma perspective. So I feel like maybe they're more open-minded.
So the dogs would be more of a social icebreaker when it comes to the office setting versus the cane kind of being more seen as like a tool that's folded up and put away.
I can also actually crack somebody on the ankles with my cane if they tick me off.
It's Rhonda. I can't help but wonder if those who choose to become guide dog handlers are already more independent and working to begin with.
That's possible. I am going to go on the record and say I've seen some guide dog handlers who would put the lie to that theory. There's a certain level of symbiosis that I've seen my close colleagues and friends who are guide dog handlers have with their dogs. And Danika, as a guide dog handler herself, can speak to that more. But there's a symbiosis there. And if you don't have that symbiosis, then it's a lot harder to integrate with the dog as a functioning team member. And I've seen people and dogs that don't click. And then I've seen people and dogs that click. And I think we want to be careful not to paint everyone with the same brush.
Mm-hmm. And I think, too, kind of what we were wondering as well is if the person, like you said, it's their personality and they're more independent to begin with, and that's why they got accepted to get the dog, or if the dog is the factor that's influencing their independence overall.
Could it be too that if you're not, if I'm
I've talked to some people that are, maybe they are doing things, but maybe not working, and don't feel that they should apply for a dog because they feel like they wouldn't get enough use out of that. So I wonder if that's part of it too.
So like the utilization of the dog.
Yeah.
That's an interesting point. Danika, do you remember if we actually figured out, because we know everybody's ages, and we know how long they've had a dog, did we actually try to do a general sense of when people got a dog?
I don't think we asked that because the years were 10 or more years.
Yeah, that's right. So it was not a how many years did you have a dog? It was which one of the following.
Yeah.
So we couldn't do that math. Okay. All
That
right.
would be interesting to look into.
Yeah, it is interesting to look into. I mean, I would imagine that there's, if you'll pardon the pun, a tail for the younger. Sorry, my apologies to all the dogs. There's potentially a tail where the younger you are, the less likely you are to be matched with a dog, perhaps. And part of that is incidence of sight loss in youth versus incidence of sight loss in seniors and so on. But it's an interesting point. What do you need the dog for? And if you get the dog, are you getting the dog for purposes that already put you out there in the space, whereas if you're not moving around, then you wouldn't necessarily want one. So that's a good question, actually, and something definitely worthwhile testing. It speaks to, does the dog impact your social isolation, or does your social isolation impact whether or not you get a dog?
I feel like that might be a bit of both. Like, you know how people try to put nature versus nurture against each other, but really they're things that work together. I think in this case, it might be a bit of like one contributing to the other, like more of a circle than two lines or two things.
I think that's valid. I'm a geneticist, and so in the nature versus nurture argument, everyone expects me to fall down on the nature side, and I don't, and I confound a lot of people. So I think the interaction with the environment and how you as a human being interact with the environment, if you're in Ashley's session this morning and you listen to Ashley talk about internal versus external locus of control, it's the same idea. What do you do to influence your environment versus what does your environment do to influence you? And so yeah, it is a little bit of both. What that ends up meaning is in designing programs and designing interventions, you have to realize that it's a little bit of both, and it's not as simplistic as one or the other.
Are there any more comments about this question? So we have a total of 3 discussion questions. So the second one is, why do you think the post-secondary education rates are higher for guide dog handlers when compared to white cane users? Go ahead.
Okay, so I think part of the reason that I have always seen it as, again, it goes back to the whole independence thing, that like the people that have guide dogs are more likely to get up and do things that are new and different. That's just really, really generalizing it. And I think the dog facilitates all of that, going back to the fact that the dog is an icebreaker and the dog is also a calming presence.
So it also depends on when someone gets the dog, because the data are agnostic to when you got the dog, right? And so if you got the dog younger and your post-secondary graduation rate is higher, then that's one thing. But if your post-secondary graduation rate is higher and that helps you figure out that you want a dog, that's a different issue, right? And the two of them come together in this question, and we have to be careful to make sure that we understand the difference between the two.
For those who get it later, I'm wondering if, because in order to apply for a dog, you have to have some degree of, it's not like you have to write an essay, but you do need to kind of understand how the process works and be able to work through that. And so if you have that post-secondary degree behind you, then you're maybe more likely to be able to kind of get through that process.
So the communication portion of it all is what you're referring to.
Okay.
Yep.
Question 3.
So the last discussion question we have is, do you think technology is utilized differently for guide dog handlers versus non-guide dog handlers? Or could it be utilized differently?
I think it is a little bit because my dog would help me find certain things, but I still would use a GPS to figure out where I am. Whereas right now I'm a keen user, not by choice, and I'm finding that using the GPS is still not as great as having a dog with the GPS.
So in your experience using the GPS with the dog, would you say it's like smoother versus the cane? Are there any other comments about this? No? Okay. We'll move on then. Thank you, everybody, for participating in the discussion. So the kind of key messages and takeaways are guide dog handlers had a higher employment rate compared with non-guide dog users, and that's according to the comparison with the ILES data. Education rates were much higher for guide dog handlers compared to non-guide dog handlers, again, according to the ILES data. Most guide dog users who have been employed as a guide dog handler had accommodating employers as well. A high number of guide dog handlers utilize smart technologies such as phones and tablets and the apps that go along with those types of technologies compared to other research that has also been done. And it's unclear why guide dog handlers have higher levels of employment or even education, but I think those are areas that need to be further explored, which leads into the future research. So areas that guide dog users feel they need more support. So things based on the access portion of the survey, which kind of related to access to transportation and access denials in general, which wasn't covered in this presentation, but it was a finding that was important with the research project overall. Exploring educational experiences and outcomes of guide dog handlers. So like we were saying, understanding if there's a difference depending on when the guide dog partnership begins. So if it's during like a high school age and then someone goes off into post-secondary, or if it's after post-secondary and seeing if there's a difference between the levels and the rates of the educational outcomes. Research with a larger range of participants would also allow us to separate out provincial differences, which, like we said, we weren't able to do, but I think that's important in understanding kind of where a lot of the focus needs to take place in ensuring people are having their needs met. And that could also be related to the access laws as well, and seeing if different provinces with different access laws have more barriers for those guide dog users as well. So there were some limitations to the study. So there was a very low sample size, but there's no way to actually compare this with the total number of guide dog users in Canada. So our sample size was 96 participants, but there's actually no national registry within Canada to understand how many guide dog users exist. So that creates discrepancy in understanding how much of this population is actually represented in our data as well.
This is also why, before Danika goes on with respect to limitations, this is also why we did everything in our power to actually triangulate the results of this study as much as we could. So we were able to do technology use patterns actually across 3 studies. The ILES, the tech use study that we did with the marketing team at Cnib, and this one, all of which had large enough guide dog user populations between 90 and 150 that we could actually compare the results. And likewise with the employment rates, we're able to compare between 2 studies. So we know that these data are meaningful because we're able to triangulate and validate the results across a couple of different studies to get the same kind of result. In the discussion period, someone's going to probably ask, well, why don't we know the number of guide dog users in Canada? And that, as Danika said, there's no registry. We can make some educated guesses, and we can take you through the back of the envelope calculations in the question period. But I mean, there isn't something that says, here are the 4,000 people in Canada who use guide dogs, and I just pulled that number out of thin air, right? And because we don't have that, we have people choosing to participate because they choose to participate. And we wouldn't want such a registry to necessarily exist because it's a bit of a thing. I'm not sure that having a registry of individuals who are guide dog handlers or part of guide dog teams is a necessarily good thing, because if that data are out there in terms of names, then it can get used for random nefarious purposes. Anyway.
Thank you.
In the ILES, the sample size for white cane users, so it was about 50% of 1,200, so 600 people.
Oh, so this one is a bigger sample?
Oh yeah, because white cane users are much more prevalent than guide dog users are.
So as I mentioned earlier, there wasn't that big enough sample size to compare the provincial differences, so that would be something that would be important to look at in future. There's also sector of employment wasn't asked. So compared to the ILES, the sector and type of employment was asked. And I think that would be something that would be really interesting in future research to be able to compare and see if there's differences among the sector of employment between guide dog users and white cane users. Participants also felt that the area of transit was lacking in the survey, which doesn't have to do with what we presented today, but it was a limitation that was made throughout the survey. And another thing as well is level of vision loss, as well as the onset of vision loss weren't areas that were asked. So this would be interesting to kind of figure out when it comes to employment and to see the type of educational outcomes that people are having. And as mentioned before, the survey was only offered in an online format, so that might not be totally representative of the whole population.